Hello, and welcome to the HP TV podcast presented by Riverside. They made this bookshelf behind me and sent it to me complimentarily. I'm Mitchell Marshall, here along with Jamie and Steven, my co-hosts of the Harry Potter TV show podcast. And today is going to be a deep dive, our first character deep dive into maybe the most complex and intriguing character, Albus, Wulfric, Brian, Percival, though it's definitely out of order, Dumbledore the Third. And Jamie's got the Barbie right there. He should have showed up in Barbie, the film.
I don't think it's actually Barbie Mattel brand, but maybe I don't know.
Well, I feel like a fraud.
For the record, the order is Albus, Percival, Wulfric, Brian, Dumbledore.
Yeah, I don't know why I can never remember that.
APWBD. It's not that hard
I might be like
geez.
low-key a little bit mini dyslexic. You know how some people are a little bit OCD? That's me. I'm also a little bit dyslexic, but maybe it's just me being dumb. I don't know. I'd also like to apologize. I feel like there's not as much volume in my hair as normal. Anyway, let's move on to some important things. So no big news this week. Harry Potter's birthday has passed us by. Nothing released on that day. Now people are like, ooh, maybe the first day of Back to Hogwarts we'll get something. But we don't know. We feel pretty concrete that we have some good news. And that it is going to be an 8-episode first season. We were really worried it was going to be 6. And felt like that could be rushed, especially wanting a couple episodes of Harry pre-Hogwarts. But Stephen, this is actually one of the cinematographers or directors who is Brazilian, and he was interviewed by a Brazilian outlet. And you have verified, Stephen, he's fluent in Portuguese. And Stephen, you went through all this, and we feel like we're pretty sure what he said is accurate.
I mean, it's a really solid source, right? He is the principal director of photography for the series, and so even the episodes he's not filming directly himself, he's in charge of all of the planning and everything. And he's talking about 8 episodes. He himself is doing 4 of them. And then he's got the other director of photography that are going to be reporting to him, handling those other episodes. So,
and you said he's doing like
rumor.
At least 1, 2, and 8 and one more. So if he said, I know I'm doing the finale and that's 8, he's right. And by the way, if you're just finding this out, which I'm sure you're not, if you're listening to this podcast, you would have known sooner if you followed us on TikTok at HPTV. So Steven did. He recapped it for us.
When it comes to your Harry Potter TV show podcasts, we have our own personal translator. So,
we do.
Steven
well,
came in
if
good
it's in Portuguese or
if
within the first
language.
340 days of Duolingo Spanish.
Also, a little bit of the British to American English. We got Mitchell to help us out.
I do localize some of the Potterness. I knew what punting meant. No, I didn't actually. I've only lived here for 5 years. The other thing, we saw a nice Reddit post that said that recapped everything we've heard and seen from filming for the first 2 weeks. And it was a nice breakdown. I don't think I saw anything new in there. We got all the recaps of the set photos, character photos. We know of different locations where they're going out, even if it's a B unit, a second director going out there. Is there anything from those first couple weeks you guys thought of? Otherwise, I was just kind of like, a lot has kind of been going on.
I don't think so. I think it's interesting because right now it seems like they're doing a lot of the on location stuff on the front end. Like they're out at the zoo. We know there was stuff about them shooting on whatever island, so to be the hut on the rock and all of that. But when you think about book 1, I mean, the vast majority of it is in the castle and in the grounds. And so I think that's where they're going to, at some point in time here, it's going to move to just being up on set, and we're not going to be able to get those sneak peeks unless everybody with the drone starts taking the risk of flying in there again.
We just need
sounds like
one guy
to
get arrested every week for going and flying a drone.
So
I don't mind not
everyone
seeing
take a hit,
that stuff. I think the thing we got at the zoo is maybe the most fun thing we've seen. It's like, if we get one of those every once in a blue moon, and then, they start releasing stuff at some point. I'm patient. Like there is a solid rumor Lithgow said, didn't he, that he is starting filming on August 4th, which is the day we're recording actually. So as of today, I don't think they're going to do an on-set photo, but I think that will be telling. I think what he looks like as Dumbledore is a huge step above like what Hagrid looks like. How they decide to, because people complain about Jude Law kind of being in a suit all the time, and people complain about Gambon kind of being in just the big gray thing, whereas we want the little bit more bombastic Dumbledore fits. He's supposed to have kind of the classic wizard robes quite a bit. There you go. Oh, those glasses.
Did you do his hair just like that?
I just lost his hat somewhere.
It went flying when you grabbed it.
Yeah, I did attempt to brush his hair before. For those listening, I'm holding up the Dumbledore Barbie.
The texture of his hair and beard are so different.
His beard's like a plastic thing.
The only other thing I've seen
exact
is
same dolls actually, but they've lost pretty much all of the clothing and accessories. So we have
I
a bunch
don't
of
think I
naked
had
Harry
any
Potter
dolls
dolls in my
anywhere.
house.
Speaking of Dumbledore, we're going to dive now into the character of Albus Dumbledore. We've kind of broken this down, and we'll each kind of go through some different elements. And look, we're not scholars, but the conclusion of this is really going to be like, what is most important from his personality and his story that needs to be translated to the screen by Lithgow over this series? Because he is, I think you could say, the second most important character. And even if you put him lower than that, he's a top 5 most important character in the series. He's the adult that carries a lot of emotional things through, and he's a person that we have a lot of depth to. Although I do want to say, like, we're mostly going to be working off of book canon, but there's things that got addressed, like in the Fantastic Beasts, or J.K. Rowling has said that, like, we can't completely ignore, canon wise, whatever that means to you. But let's talk about Mr. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. And I said that right because I was looking at the notes. So first of all, we're going to go kind of through a timeline, but this is going to, we're not just going to ramble through. This is going to give us some idea of where different elements of this will come, and it'll give us a nice baseline. So Jamie's going to start us off with the early life of Albie.
Oh, Albie. All right. So we know that Albus was born in 1881. There's back and forth on the birthday. There's never a birthday given. The wiki seems pretty sure it's sometime in August, but it could be August or July. It could be my birthday, which is August 17th. So it's somewhere in there. And he was born.
Yes.
Yeah, let's just say it is. He's the eldest child of Percival and Kendra Dumbledore. He has 2 siblings, Aberforth and Ariana, and they lived in the wizarding village of Mold on the Wold. Ariana's life changed at 6 when 3 Muggle boys saw her doing magic and tortured her. The trauma caused her magic to become uncontrollable. Magical outbursts that endangered everyone, which we think is kind of an obscurus. Their father retaliated against the boys and was arrested and sent to Azkaban, and he never told anyone why, to protect her from ministry interference, and it's believed he died shortly after that. Kendra, Dumbledore's mom, moved the family to Godric's Hollow and wanting to shield Ariana and keep them safe from scrutiny. In 1899, Ariana's uncontrolled magic accidentally killed her mother during an outburst. Albus had just graduated from Hogwarts and had become the head of the household essentially at that point. And this grew a lot of early responsibility, guilt, and secrecy, which shaped who he became. A brilliant, ambitious man, always weighed down by the stuff that happened in his past. The quote we have from their childhood is from Aberforth in Deathly Hallows chapter 28, where it says, "Secrets and lies, that's how we grew up. And Albus, he was a natural." So he's kind of talking about how his mom, they grew up hiding things and hiding who their sister was, and all that turned out to really affect how Dumbledore worked with Harry and navigated the whole trying to beat Voldemort thing.
Yeah, I think the thing that we realize from his childhood is he had this dysfunction. This is something we see a lot in stories. This is a dysfunctional home life, but he was an absolute genius and a rock star. He was, corresponding with the great minds of the age at Hogwarts. And so it is interesting to me now. I'm going to talk about a critical juncture, a few important little bits of the Grindelwald time, this transition from finishing Hogwarts into starting his professional life, because it seems like he could have done anything. And we'll later talk about themes in his life that determined what he decided to do and to not do, but that is all kind of from this crux of time. So in 1899, this is when he's leaving Hogwarts and he's supposed to go on his 1 year, apparently back then, traditional travel with Elphius Doge around the world and see the world. And I think for Dumbledore, it's interesting. He must have done some travel at some point, because he just seems, he's one thing that seems to kind of transcend the British culture, where he just has this awareness of the world of wizardry, because we know different cultures are different when it comes to magic. And I think Joe has kind of hinted at that expansion. So I'm kind of sad he didn't get to do that. I think we should do an Around the World in 80 Days with Dumbledore in it. That should be a good spinoff. But he has a couple. I mean, this whole summer's an inciting incident, but I think his mother's dying is quite a thing, because it keeps him home. It's the reason he meets Gellert Grindelwald, and it's just another painful thing. And it also further kind of enhances his responsibility to his family when he wants to do so much more outside of it. And the way that he treats that, for better and for worse, leads to ways he makes decisions when it comes to the people he cares about or what he owes to the world later on. So he's introduced to Bathilda Bagshot's nephew. Bathilda Bagshot, of course, the famed author of A History of Magic, which is, I think, it sounds like it's ever growing, like it gets expanded over time. She lives quite long, even into our main book series. But her nephew is Gellert Grindelwald, who was kicked out of Durmstrang. And it seems like this summer was just 2 months, but where these two young men presumably fell in love, definitely from Albus's side, and they just were fascinated to meet someone who might have been at their level when it came to the fascination and the power of magic. And that's when Dumbledore also kind of falls in love with the ideas that Grindelwald pitches, including the greater good. And it's so funny because for me, the greater good will always be Harry Potter first. But as I look through the time of pop culture and all these different superhero stories, the greater good has always been around and will always be around, because there is like a weight of what is right. Or, you know, the trolley problem: do you sacrifice one life for many? And in this case, do you do something sort of evil to do what's actually best for the world? And so they tangle with those ideas, and Dumbledore finds himself falling in love with power, which he then kind of makes a self-determined turn away from that, which I'll kind of address again later. But the only thing that keeps him away from this, of course, is that Grindelwald, I think he overplays his hand. They end up dueling, the three of them, and when Dumbledore's sister dies, like, that is the end of that movement with Grindelwald. And that's where love starts to come into play. And one of their important themes throughout this is like that love for his family, and then the fear of himself. And so this is one thing. Now, I did take this from the Fantastic Beasts movies, but I don't think it's outside of Dumbledore's character as we know him from the canon books. He says to Newt, "Gellert and I had made plans to go away together. My brother didn't approve. One night he confronted us. Voices were raised, threats made. Aberforth drew his wand, which was foolish. I drew my wand, which was even more foolish. Gellert just laughed. No one heard Ariana coming downstairs. Can't say for certain it was my spell. Doesn't really matter. 1 minute she was there, and the next she was gone." And I think that pain, you know, thank you, Jude Law, for your beautiful performance, I think echoes throughout the rest of his decisions. So like this one summer, we talk about his boy genius childhood, and now Stephen will talk about his career. I think this summer and this breakup, and then this going forward, a stalemate with one of the most evil wizards of all time, it sets Dumbledore and his views on love and his self-awareness as someone who needs to fear power, but also protect. And so I think that summer in his timeline is going to echo throughout the rest of the discussion. Stephen is going to keep us rolling with his career and his rise to power.
It's really interesting to me though, because I think Dumbledore is kind of forced to, like we talked about love, right, being so important. He's kind of forced to like decide between this infatuation type of love that he has with, you know, power and with Grindelwald, and like his family, right, and his brother and all of that. And so he decides to stay and do things. Now, I found this really interesting because I go through the story and like the timeline and what we know. Little disclaimer here is that there are a lot of sources out there on the interwebs where I believe these people put in a lot of effort to extrapolate information, but in some cases they're presenting dates that I don't know where they got dates from exactly, but I'm going to assume that they have had enough time to really be sure that this is accurate. No, so looking at like the timeline, so I didn't know that there was a 20-year gap between this and the next things we know about Dumbledore's life, right? So it was around 1899 when Ariana died and Grindelwald left, and 1920-ish when he started working at Hogwarts. So we have 20 years in the middle here where we don't really know exactly what happened. We know initially he stayed in Godric's Hollow with Aberforth, but as Mitchell talked about, we know that he had a good understanding of international wizards and, you know, different approaches to magic. So I assume he did traveling in there in the meantime, but I think we can assume that from the earlier parts of this time frame, he was probably really afraid of his own power. And, you know, as he thought about, you know, all the things he's going to do to try to kind of take over the world, and that resulted in the death of someone he really loved, he shares later that he made it a point to shy away from power going forward. So we know 20 years passed. Eventually, he took up a position as a professor at Hogwarts. and that was early 1920s. Some sources say that he was actually the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor first, which I had not come across, but I'd be
Well, it
interested to
does
know where
say
they said that.
the Fantastic Beast canon implies that he was already teaching at Hogwarts in the 19. I know we're going book canon and we've extrapolated that from somewhere, but I think where it fits, just say that, oh, maybe he taught something for a while and that's how he knew, because otherwise how would he know Newton, like whatever her name Lestrange is.
Lita,
But
yeah.
in the book timeline, like maybe it makes sense that he would have started earlier, but it also makes sense that he would have been making friends and learning and growing.
I don't know where it was stated at, but the headmaster at this time pushed him out of being the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, and that's why he became Transfiguration. I don't know why, though. I don't know.
I think that's fascinating. But the more I was looking at this part of the story, I think it's a really interesting time. Like this is some really cool material that could be fleshed out, right? Like there could be kind of young Dumbledore. Like, what did he do? How did he recover from these tragic events? And how did he end up being a teacher of all things? You know,
people connect when you get the timeline for this Wizarding War, whether it included Newt or not. We kind of know it had to stretch out over time. They give 1926 to 1945 as the dates, and so 1945, obviously World War II. 1926, so it's like, yeah, no matter what, you have 25 years. Even if he was teaching for 16 of those, or part-time teaching or this or that, like there's a lot of time in there. I think you're right, Steve. I think it's his development at this time and how he handled the tragedy of that summer and how it echoes into him as a teacher and his post Grindelwald life. Like it's missing.
Yeah. But really, I mean, he's basically 40, right? When he starts working at Hogwarts as a teacher. And so there's a lot of life that happens in between. And then, yeah, the war with Grindelwald really kicks off. I know. Crazy old. That's how old I'll be next year. So, not feeling bad about that at all. We know that this is when he also discovered Tom Riddle, right? So he was the one to go and tell him that he was a wizard and give him his letter to attend Hogwarts. And he, lights the wardrobe on fire and kind of discovers that Tom Riddle is a little sociopath. But we also know, just again from Fantastic Beasts and from other sources, that he was a pretty eccentric but brilliant teacher, that his students liked him, and that he worked on some pretty incredible things in the meantime, right? He discovered the 12 uses of dragon's blood, and he also, to some degree, worked with Nicholas Flamel on developing the Philosopher's Stone throughout these years. So he wasn't just a great teacher, but he was also a magical theorist, and he was quite famous for this. He corresponded with magical intellectuals like he did during school, and he continued to do that. But another really important piece was that he had a role in the Wizengamot. At some point, he rose to become the chief warlock of the Wizengamot. Now, the Wizengamot is a mixture of kind of a judicial branch of the magical government as well as legislative. Like they make a lot of the rules around keeping things secret, as well as judging people and determining what their sentences should be and those kinds of things. So he was the chief warlock of that body for a while, but he wasn't a politician. So he actually repeatedly declined the post of Minister for Magic, even though he probably would have been pretty good at it. I think we know that he had a lot of fear about taking on that kind of power and how he might handle doing that. And then during Order of Phoenix, we find out that he is actually removed from these posts, right? So they take away all of his Wizengamot positions and everything, and he gets them back later once the truth comes out. But that's kind of his foray into the political sphere, and some of those things is helping, really, I think, more on the side of the justice system.
He also became the Mugwump.
Yeah, Supreme Mugwump.
So I don't know if we mentioned that, but yeah. He does during that time, and that's also something he loses in Order of the Phoenix.
Exactly. Yeah, they kind of take away all those different positions from him. But then I think it kind of does culminate, like we talked about in 1945 was a really big piece, is when he confronts Grindelwald. And so they have a legendary duel, which we still don't know a ton about, other than it was legendary. But when you think about it, to the degree that on the Hot Chocolate Frog card that he's on, like 3 things are mentioned. And one of those is the duel with Grindelwald and it being so legendary. So that's something we need to see on screen at some point in time. But so it wasn't just that he won the war, but like this was a personal victory for him, right? After all the things that had happened and all the responsibility that he felt for the things that went on with Grindelwald, he was the one to actually be able to stop him in the end, which was pretty important. So I want to give Tommy just a second to jump in here because he's wanted to say hi on the podcast for a long time now. And Tommy, we're talking all about Albus Dumbledore today.
Give us 3 sentences on what you think about Albus Dumbledore.
He's old. He has a beard and he wears glasses.
Nailed it.
Anything else about his
Is he
magical
good,
abilities
bad,
or
good
him
at?
as a leader.
I mean, I know he won the Elder Wand.
Yeah, that's a pretty big one. That is a key part of defeating Grindelwald. It's true. He got the Elder Wands, but cool. Well, we're going to probably have you come and visit again some other time and tell us more about what you like about Harry Potter, okay?
Okie dokie.
All right, get out of here, bud.
We can do a quiz. When I was there, Tommy did a quiz off with me, so we could do a quiz off with Tommy.
So, yeah, it's funny because now we're going to skip another 50 years here, right? From 1945 until the 90s, when presumably he was just during that time teaching and leading, and people generally thinking he was good, and there being a lot of peace in the wizarding world, other than, I guess, the Wizarding Wars, 11 years before Harry Potter's time. But we don't know all that much about what he was doing during the first Wizarding War. We know he had an order and everything, but it's funny because he kind of had the OG order around the Grindelwald time that was a little bit more international. It's a little more entertaining. But then the next critical part to our story is really the Harry Potter years. So Jamie, what is the important bits of the timeline for our Harry Potter years?
So I started a little earlier. I started in 1981. So at this point, he has had the Order of the Phoenix set up for the first battle against Voldemort, and sadly, Voldemort kills James and Lily Potter. Dumbledore, as we'll find out, obviously all the spoilers if you haven't read the books or watched the movies, that Dumbledore didn't know the Secret Keeper was switched, so he could not save them. And he coordinates leaving Harry on the doorstep of Lily's sister. And it's a decision later revealed that that's based on Lily's blood protection magic working through Petunia. And so that's the first time we see Dumbledore, and really one of the first people we see in the books, outside the Dursleys and Cat McGonagall. So this sets up how we see Dumbledore. He's like a protector, there's secrecy, sacrifice. He's kind of maneuvering things from a distance in Harry's life, and he kind of does that for everyone as we kind of learn who he's helping. Like the Potters, he was trying to protect, but he kind of did it indirectly by having other people be the Secret Keeper and all that kind of stuff, which he regrets later. So across the 7 books, he becomes a mentor to Harry. His role evolves from like mysterious mentor to direct mentor to strategic manipulator of everything going on, but always with love, but not always fully honest. And the Philosopher's Stone, really what we first learn about Dumbledore is through Hagrid. Hagrid is sent to make sure Harry gets his Hogwarts letter because the Dursleys keep intervening with that. Hagrid says, best headmaster Hogwarts ever had. Dumbledore's reputation builds through the chocolate frog that Harry gets, and they are Stephen already talked a little bit about that, but that's like the information we get on him. So we hear from Hagrid about how great he is, and he's just like this amazing figure, and then we start hearing the accomplishments he has. And the first guy kind of trying to mentor Harry is through the whole Quirrell Voldemort and then the Mirror of Erised, and that's kind of like we see him jump in and out and try to guide Harry, but it's really Harry's quest, Harry on his own. And it's almost like he's starting to test Harry's morals and what Harry will do in these situations. Then we jump into Chamber of Secrets, where we really learn that he trusts Harry. He believes Harry when a lot of people don't. And one of the good quotes is, it's our choices, Harry, that show us who we really are, far more than our ability. And he's just planting seeds and reinforcing like the moral responsibilities that Harry has and is going to have. What we learn of him in Prisoner of Azkaban is he encourages Hermione to use the Time Turner to save Sirius and Buckbeak without openly breaking the law. So he's kind of good about hiding behind making other people do things, which his brother complains about later. He continues to withhold truths about Harry and his connection to Voldemort, and he teaches Harry to look beyond the obvious. In Goblet of Fire, he kindly does not shield Harry from the tournament dangers. I think personally that Dumbledore, not that he knew he was going to be in the Goblet of Fire and all that, but that it was a good test for him to see what Harry could overcome. And then he continues to keep the prophecy secret, which we learn about later. Order of the Phoenix, he withdraws from Harry completely because of the connection. And this is where like, Harry grows angry. I think we grow frustrated as readers. I think that's a reason a lot of people don't like Order of the Phoenix, is because of Dumbledore's behavior. He becomes like very different to us. And
Well, it's a very good example of just how the lack of information is so frustrating, right? And so part of Dumbledore's like strength with Harry is that he's been maybe even a little too transparent in some ways, like letting things happen to him, but like by blocking him off or pulling away, it made it really hard to like trust him. Be like, what's going on? Who's this guy, and why should Harry continue to follow him?
Yeah, and that's why, like, I put miscalculation because Dumbledore even admits at the end of this book that he messed up. He was trying to protect Harry and protect everyone else by distancing himself from Harry because Voldemort was manipulating Harry through this connection, but this damages their bond and it's like the first crack in their bond. And then we have Half-Blood Prince where he really pulls Harry more in as direct mentor because he learned from the last book. And so they have private lessons about Voldemort's past, and then they learn about the Horcruxes. He again conceals in secret that he is dying, that with his hand and stuff, which we'll learn about a little bit later. And he sets up this whole thing behind the scenes with Snape protecting Draco, and it becomes a lot more strategic and training Harry really for his own death, for his sacrifice. And he's preparing him to be the chosen one, or what to do as the chosen one. And then he dies in that book, but we'll talk about that in a minute too. And then Deathly Hallows, we just really see the workings of what he's done, but we also learn so much about him through Rita Skeeter's book, which is like based in truths, but a lot of lies. And it breaks Harry's idolized image of Dumbledore. But we just learn a lot more about his past, and we watch Harry come to terms with that as we're coming to terms with that. And then we see Dumbledore come back to Harry in the end when Harry's kind of dead-ish when at King's Cross. And he's trying to teach Harry still in that moment, which I love about Dumbledore. And so those are the things that we really see throughout the books because Harry's obviously our protagonist. And that's how we see the growth of his and Harry's relationship throughout the Harry Potter years.
I think it's really over those books, obviously, when we get to see the most of Dumbledore, right? The books and the movies, and just kind of get a sense of who he is. But it is interesting that in the first book, we get the quote, right? To the well-organized mind, death is but the next great adventure. And I think it gives so much it just speaks so much to Dumbledore as a person who's lived more than a century and the perspective that he has. And maybe that's his own experience, but also knowing Nicholas Flamel and some of that. But it all, as you think about all of the manipulation and all of the pieces he's moving around the board all the time, it's interesting that there is this kind of perspective that, hey, like if someone dies, that's not necessarily the worst possible thing, right? That's the next great adventure. And so even for himself, when he, touches the ring and his hand is cursed and he knows that his own death is coming, he's still able to kind of focus on business, right? On the greater good, arguably, and making sure the plan is all set up to work in his absence. But it's a very interesting way, I think, just to look at someone who's been around a long time and he has this perspective on life and how things can go. And even with these folks who are younger and maybe a bit more rash, he just kind of directs them and prepares them in a way so they can make those decisions themselves in hopes that his, I guess, wisdom has rubbed off on them.
It's a little bit of a dichotomy to think of, the perspective he has, but then the fixations and the weaknesses that he have and the way that they manifest themselves. And also, Stephen, I love that quote, death is but the next great adventure. I've said it since, and in fact, I have said it in religious settings, and I think sometimes people are like, can you blend those two? And what does that mean? But it's just me, the way I think it's a positive way to look at the afterlife. But then when you think of it as, he thought if these people die, it doesn't matter. It's just another adventure. Anyway, not that he was implying that, but it kind of sounded like it, greater good.
Take for sure, yeah.
Yeah, I have a hard time with some of it because it's like, I love Alberforce, what he says about his brother because it's raw and also it's his perspective, just as Elphias Doge gives his perspective. And Rita Skeeter supposedly got a lot of this from Bagshot, and whatever way she got that information, we're kind of led to believe a lot of what Harry reads is true, but also some of it is phrased so bombastically that I am like, where are the lies? Like, I don't think we get clarity on some of that. So it is interesting to think what is truly book canon about Dumbledore's history, but it is seeing him unraveled over the books is actually really well done because he does start out as an almost omniscient and whimsical, but also powerful character. So from there, let's jump into some thematic analysis, kind of jump out of the timeline and now start applying some of these things. So this is funny because I wrote these 3 L's kind of as a joke, but we're going to I'm going to cover leader, lover, loser. a loser of all things. But as a leader, I think he did lead the Order of the Phoenix. He does lead Hogwarts. And even though he was never a politician in the way that he wanted to lead the country as the Minister of Magic or that country's politics, he was involved in like the UN of sorts and the judicial side of sorts. Like he was very influential. And so it's funny to think he was reluctant, but then also it seemed like he was self-aware enough to know where he could have positive influence and then where he might be tempted to influence things in such a way that could go back to the greater good. He might turn that way again and start pushing that agenda. And he had so much fear of that because of this impact of his time that sometimes I'm like, you were still in a position to influence some of that stuff. But
well, can I add to like,
yeah, go.
There's a quote I love in King's Cross, the second King's Cross chapter in Deathly Hallows, where he says, "It's a curious thing, Harry, but perhaps those who are best suited to power are those who have never sought it." And I think he's not talking about himself, even though you might think that, because I think he has wanted power, but he knows the danger of himself wanting power. So it's interesting to watch him navigate that. Like, he doesn't want to be Minister of Magic and have that direct power, but he does feel in himself to influence things. And we do see that, even though it's not book canon, in Fantastic Beasts, where he's chosen by the Chillin. What are those?
Yes.
The
I think you
Chillin?
got it.
Chillin.
To be at that point in time, but he doesn't want that power. And he later on does become the Mugwump, but in that moment, he's like, no, this isn't for me right now, because he's still working through his trauma from when he was young.
He finds
Love
that
that,
trust.
'cause-
Yeah. Go on.
Yeah, one of the quotes that I saved was actually from Fantastic Beasts 3. Sorry. So it's do you know why I admire you, Newt? He says, more perhaps than any other man I know, you do not seek power. You simply ask, is a thing right? And I think that that's a really interesting, the other side of that, right? Is like, hey, we don't even seek power. Sometimes, you get asked to do things anyway, but someone who's actually concerned with what's right and what's wrong instead brings a very different element to the story. And I think Newt did that really well. He wasn't, after any of that kind of stuff, he just wanted to make sure that right won out in the end, I guess.
Defend for the greater good. But yeah, there is kind of like a thought of, do ends justify the means? And I think Dumbledore never even trusted himself to implement something where he might take it such a dangerous direction, feeling where it ends. Although when I say, do the ends justify the means, if it's better for every type of being on Earth for wizards to be in control, I think that's the question where I'm like, why did he even think that needed to be considered? And I think that's Grindelwald, which we'll talk about in a second. But I just say the last thing on leader for Dumbledore is that he blurred the lines with Harry and other people, and we'll talk about under loser kind of people who he might have let down, but he blurs the lines of teacher, leader, father figure, mentor. Those things are interchangeable in a lot of characters, but it's interesting where he might have let people down with those, and they're all from leadership qualities that he's in the position to mentor people and to be a father figure, or even just a teacher, and where he could have gone wrong with that. So as far as lover goes, we don't know if he was Grindelwald's lover, but we know he loved him. And maybe you guys will have something on this. I do wonder if Grindelwald loved Dumbledore. Was he as enthralled by Dumbledore as he was? The reason I'd say maybe is because he over time seems to do the right thing in the end. But I felt like Grindelwald maybe did love Dumbledore, but also there was this seduction of power and this seduction of ideology. And because Dumbledore was so enamored with him, it made it easier to fall for that and to join his way of thinking. That summer if that summer was only 2 months, it is wild. And to think about that, the way that made Dumbledore scared of his seduction towards power and his maybe craving sometimes of that power, and also set him up as the way he was going to from then on fix his relationships and maybe live a life without romantic partnership. That is crazy. And I also think it tells us something about Voldemort, is that Voldemort's whole thing is the absence of love. Whereas if Grindelwald did love Dumbledore, or did use love in a false manner to seduce Dumbledore, I think that is really cool to have two villains with such different relationships to this core element of magic. And so when it comes to love and Dumbledore, I think Dumbledore did love his students. I think he did love Harry. And I think he saw that absence of love in Tom Riddle, which is most critical to our story. I will say with love in the magical world, I have a hard time sometimes what elements of love and magic are inherent versus which ones are active. Like how active was Lily's protection of Harry, and how much did that love protecting him come from like a direct decision and just something that is a little bit more natural, and how that love influences Harry and his decisions and actual power and magical interactions with Voldemort, because Dumbledore seemed to be really interested in that concept. And maybe they studied it in the Department of Mysteries, but I think Dumbledore's love for Grindelwald and that as an inciting incident, and then the way he shows love to others and sees love as a magical element is really critical to our story.
Well, I love that you bring that up, because where you talk about how proactive you'd have to be in, leveraging love maybe in order to protect people, because Lily does it for Harry. Harry does it for pretty much everybody in the Battle of Hogwarts that's on the side of good, right? And Voldemort's spells are unable to kind of bind, I guess is what he says. Yeah, but I then think about the Malfoys, right? And Narcissa and Lucius at the end are just running for Draco. All they're trying to do is find him and get their family together and leave. And it just kind of makes me think through, like you said, it's something that happens automatically when you sacrifice yourself. Like, had Narcissa jumped in front of a spell for him, would she then have left protection on Draco, even though they're not considered the good guys? So it's a very interesting that love is love, I guess, and what kind of in the wizarding world what that can mean magically, right, when it comes to protecting.
Well, and I always took it for Lily that it was unintentional. Like, obviously she loves her child, but that she didn't cast a spell or do anything like that, and that's what made it so magical and such deep magic, is because it was just part of her being. But I don't know for sure.
Pure selflessness. Yeah.
And I think your point on Grindelwald and Voldemort is great, because again, a lot of this comes from the Fantastic Beasts, which whether or not you want to take that as canon, but it is from J.K. Rowling, is that he must understand love enough. Like, I don't think he's completely devoid of love. So I don't know if he loved Dumbledore. He loved the idea of power, and that was maybe mixed with lust, or just like finding someone else with that common ground. But maybe he did love him in a way, but he does manipulate people's love and relationships a lot more than Voldemort, where Voldemort's weakness is that he doesn't even understand that. Like, he can't even comprehend the protection Harry has from Lily. Like, he just thinks it's kind of a joke, like that he can clearly defeat that. Where Grindelwald, like when it comes to like Queenie and Jacob and different people's relationships, he isolates them through manipulating that love and people's connections with each other. So I do think that does like really explain a lot of their strategies as villains or as like the bad guy.
I think the power of love, great song, by the way, just watched Back to the Future again the other day, has to be earnest. Like, you can use love to manipulate, and I think Grindelwald does that. And I think by extension, and maybe at times unintentionally, Dumbledore uses that in his own manipulation, because he creates these relationships that are honest, but then he uses them in ways where love is already involved that can frustrate people or lead him astray. I think that power, like the way it breaks Voldemort's spell, you can't manufacture that. You can't be like, oh, every time a bad person wants to harm a good person, someone that they love just has to invoke love. Like, it does have to really be at this deeper level, which I think is well done, and has to be a little bit mystical. It can't quite be articulated. I think Jo uses love really literally. I think I kind of relate to the way she uses chocolate. Chocolate is supposed to actually really uptick your mood. Like, you're supposed to have chocolate after seeing a Dementor. And I always thought that's kind of silly, but it also reminds me of when people are really sad, they might eat a comfort food or have a sweet. And it's just I think almost a pleasant thing to think that can just help you in some positive way. And also, I love chocolate. Although I found that a lot of people like chocolate bars, whereas I really like chocolate cookies or chocolate cake or chocolate milkshakes. Like, I don't like it necessarily in its most pure form. Anyway, that's another story. The last L here is loser. So where does Dumbledore come out a loser? He has some failures in some relationships, and he has some manipulation of others. In some way, he failed his family. He was so fixated on power and on Grindelwald and on expanding his mind and everything that it ends up being bad for Ariana and Aberforth, who have already lost their parents. He does fail Harry in a way. I don't think there should ever be a thought of here's what Dumbledore should have, because it is honest to his character. Where should he have given Harry more information or manipulated him less? Because to some degree, I'm not saying this is like Endgame, Avengers Endgame, where only one way of doing all this had to be done a certain way, but it is like he is a fallible character who in the end did carve a path for victory. In ways, did he fail Snape? He probably knew there's a likelihood Snape was going to die, and so did Snape. But that Prince's Tale is actually another good insight into Dumbledore, and just a beautiful chapter that really fills out that character in a way. I don't think it redeems him because Snape's still an idiot. But anyway, we think Dumbledore was wildly successful in some ways when it comes to like the Cold War aspects of the Wizarding Wars. I actually think there's a show on the FX called The Americans about 2 Russian agents and the very small things that they do to progress the cause for the Russians in the States while they're pretending to be American. Incredible show, but it just made me think, look, you could never do it with Harry Potter because you want the excitement and the magic, but just all the little things. Dumbledore was such a genius. He did have power. He had philanthropy. He was great in academia. He saved many lives. So it was probably worth it in the end, but he did let people down. He did use manipulation under the guise of protection, and he knew he couldn't be trusted with certain things, but he also didn't willingly allow agency from other people with the information that he had. So it's like he didn't want to abuse his power, but he kind of didn't give other people the opportunity to make their own choices when it comes to what they wanted to do. He held all of that power in that situation. And anyway, I think that is where maybe he could be considered a loser. Also, he died. So, and it was kind of a silly thing because he was chasing after the ring. He felt like we haven't talked about the literal Deathly Hallows objects yet, because that was kind of important to him and Grindelwald's relation. That was part of the excitement and seduction, them kind of chasing this mythical element of wizardry as well. But it is interesting to think that him chasing down the Horcruxes and thinking about the stone maybe being in that ring and everything could have led to his death, and also him getting a very, very bad manicure. But anyway, did you guys have anything on loser before we jump forward to the next section?
I think that there's a lot of it so much does tie back to not just the manipulations, but the manipulations that didn't work out, right? Like, you have the things that ended tragically, like the Potters being killed, right? And even Neville's parents. And you have some of these where he's put people in dangerous situations and they go poorly, right? And so you can say on one hand, like I was saying before, like he has this grander vision where, sometimes you have to sacrifice certain pieces on the chessboard. And on the other side of that's a pretty dark thing to do, and I think he adds those people to kind of that, I don't know, heavy bag of rocks that I think of as kind of guilt that he carries around all the time. I mean, it starts off with his sister, and then he adds more and more people to it over time, and he kind of does justify it with he's doing it for a really good reason. But it's still there's a lot of losses that are racked up along the way as well, and he does ultimately, beat Voldemort, of course. But it's not
Steven,
without sacrifice.
That like plays into your next bit here. Like, what did he get right and what did he get wrong? I talked about some of it a little bit, because now I look back, he carries this heaviness with him, and there is so much complexity. But I do kind of like, I kind of like book 1 and 2 Dumbledore, although 2, things start to go wrong, right? He can't stop Slytherin's heir on his own. He can't figure that one out, even though he seems all knowing. That's the first time we see him break. Whereas in book 1, Voldemort gets into Hogwarts. That's a pretty big mistake, but then he comes in and kind of saves the day. But he does have this all knowing and savior's feel about him. So like, what did he get right? What did he get wrong? And like, I don't know, because I think that's represented in the transition we see from him from powerful to complex character, and then the pain that he kind of carries with him.
Yeah, you kind of discover these flaws over time, right? So it gets really messy because, yes, he was a wise person, he was a visionary, right? Ultimately, he was a force for good, but he kind of did the good things by manipulating people. We've talked about being very secretive, and he wasn't above sacrificing other people. It's a little funny, like we have that TikTok up, right, where we take the audio from Shrek, where John Lithgow is talking about sending knights to go get Fiona, right, from the Dragon's Tower. And we put it with Michael Gambon's the video from, I believe it was the 4th movie, right, where he's announcing the tournament. And he specifically says in there, that many of you may try this and you may die, but that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. And I think that's where the darkness comes in, right? So some of the good things are that he really drives kind of the moral backbone of the series, which is that love is stronger than power, right? Just this concept that we have more in common than we have different, and we should focus on those things and be kind to each other and help each other and love each other, right? And he builds this strategy that hinges not on brute force and on power, right? Like Voldemort does. They're not planning to come through and force everyone into something, but it's really based on self-sacrifice and free will. So he does have a lot of people who he sacrifices along the way, but in most cases, at least from as I try and think through it, he doesn't ask them to do that necessarily. He provides them with tools and resources. In many cases, he helps kind of pull the good out of them and develop them. And then by following his example, in many cases, I think they're then willing to kind of go into situations and put themselves at risk. And like you think about the Potters, right? The reason they got in the situation they did is because of the prophecy, but also because they did defy Voldemort, at least 3 times, 'cause that's what's in the prophecy. That's why he went after them. And they continually did that because they had this, example in Dumbledore of standing for what's right and doing what's good and not caving to Voldemort. And so they ended up paying a price for that. So he ensures that Voldemort is defeated, right? And it's built on choices, not on curses or on evil things, right? It's the Hallows versus Horcruxes argument, where the Horcruxes actively require someone to be murdered in order to be able to save one person's life. And the beauty of the Hallows is that many lives can be saved with these objects that don't require murdering someone to get them. And then I think finally the last good piece is just his faith in people. So you see Snape, who's a pretty deplorable character to begin with, and he has faith in Snape. He convinces Snape that there is good in him and that he should leverage that good, that love for Lily, to do good things. And Snape is a very central character in the plan. I think similar with Neville, even with like characters like Creature, right? That he deserves to be treated with respect. And had he been treated with respect by people like Sirius, then certain things probably would have played out differently. So these are moments where he really shines as a leader. But then, of course, what he gets wrong is that he's manipulative. He lies to Harry for years, right? He welcomes Harry into this wizarding world and lets him kind of enjoy all of the fun and the magic of it. And then every year it seems like he has some big reveal like, oh, yeah, your life's about to suck more when I tell you about this, right? And so eventually it's the prophecy, right? Harry's in the magical world for 5 years before he learns about the prophecy, which, kind of defined his life from that point forward. But really, since the moment he had been conceived, arguably, that prophecy was determining kind of how things went in his life. And he doesn't tell him about that. He doesn't explain anything about the Horcruxes until the last possible moment. And again, there's reasons for that. But he kept a lot to himself. And then he openly admits in Deathly Hallows to Snape, right, that he planned for Harry to die. That was part of the plan. Harry's sacrifice was basically going to be required. And we learn in the chapter Jamie referenced earlier, where they go back to King's Cross, that he had hoped that, right, that there was this little option on the side that would be able to have Harry still live through it at the end, which did work out, but it was in no way guaranteed. And so I think I've referenced this before as we talked through our other episodes, but just that he picked a new greater good. And while I think this greater good aligned more with, like Mitchell said, like happiness and liberty for everybody and not just, wizards or purebloods, it still was a greater good. And so he had to decide, hey, what are the things I'm willing to risk? Who are the people I'm willing to risk? And I think one last example of that is putting Harry with the Dursleys. I think he didn't maybe know at the time just how badly Harry was going to be neglected and abused when he took him there, but that was a long 10 years for the kid. And he, happily put him there, kind of choosing to put Harry's life and safety above his well-being and his development and happiness. And so it gets pretty gray, and where he's alive, but he's also pretty miserable. They treat him like absolute garbage. So a quote here is that Dumbledore says, "I cared more for your happiness than my plan's success." He says to Harry, he says, "More for your life than the lives that might be lost if Voldemort lived." And so that's really where the tension comes from. He wanted to protect Harry like a father, but in the end, he did not always do right by him, and he, in many ways, became a weapon in Dumbledore's hands in the war against Voldemort. So gets a little twisted there.
Well, and I think part of that is because we've discussed before in past episodes how Dumbledore didn't realize that the Dursleys were treating Harry that way. And so his biggest mistake was not checking in on Harry. And I think part of that translated into Harry's Hogwarts years, that Dumbledore tried to overcorrect that. He did take such a step back from Harry because he wanted him to be a kid and be happy, because the rest of his childhood was kind of ruined. But at the same time, in doing that, it didn't help anything or prepare Harry for the things he had to do immediately right off the bat. Harry's battling Voldemort pretty much. Also,
But isn't that what Arabella Figg was doing? Wasn't she there to like observe
She
and see
wasn't
how
very good
Harry
at-
was being treated? She just sucks at her job. I
she's
guess
not
we
very
could
good
say.
at her job. She just is with her cats.
Well said, Esteban. Like, I think it's funny that we all went into these separately, and the things that we pull out and the way that they compare, and I think has actually been really telling of Dumbledore and what we want from him and see from him. It also has shown that it's funny that we watched Fantastic Beasts, because I think they've actually added depth in a way that I guess if they're not canon, we could kind of ignore them. But when you think about what we have in these 7 books, it's not that much sometimes. And Dumbledore also only shows up in the other expanded Cursed Child very minimally as a portrait, and that's like a question unto itself. But I think it's been well established what we're pulling out. But let's move into the final bit and talk about Dumbledore's legacy, and we're going to talk about his real world, our world legacy. But first, we're going to talk about what he means to this entire fictional world, because whatever you consider canon and whatever we feel like might be the differences between his book and movie self, he is maybe the most famous wizard in at least definitely Britain and maybe all the world. So Jamie, what about his fictional legacy?
So I'll start at the end when his death. So the most we really learn about him in the actual Harry Potter book series is really after his death, through Rita Skeeter, and then really through Aberforth, and then when we have Snape's memories, really what Dumbledore was doing behind it all in the end. So we know he dies on the astronomy tower at the end of Half-Blood Prince. He was weakened by that curse from the Horcrux ring, and Snape kills Dumbledore. And then, spoiler alert, we find out later on that Dumbledore had set that whole thing up. He set up his whole death really to protect Draco. He knew he was already dying. And even his death was a love for a student, which I think we haven't really talked a lot about that here, is that part of his legacy and who he was is that he did love the students at Hogwarts. And even Draco, who was making horrible decisions and was a bully and was the son of a Death Eater, Dumbledore loved him in the end, and he saw that good in Draco. So we don't know a ton about the world within the Harry Potter books after Dumbledore dies, in that after everything's finished and Harry defeats Voldemort, how is Dumbledore perceived? Because what we're left with before that is Rita Skeeter's The Life and Lies of Albus Dumbledore, which, you know, even for us as readers, which I think is a cool part of the book, is like, whoa, what was Dumbledore doing? And the whole idea of what for the greater good meant, which I think Stephen did a good job of, like, that could mean a lot of things. And Dumbledore still did things for the greater good, but it was in a different context than what Grindelwald was talking about, or their original idea, which was really like wizards taking over to, you know, to control everything for the greater good.
I just want to say on that, Jimmy, is what's interesting about that is it never felt like a retcon to go back and say Dumbledore has a dark past. I don't know if it was even hinted at or if it just felt right, but to give him this whole backstory, we knew he had the Grindelwald adventure, and maybe J.K. Rowling had, but I wonder what elements were fully invested. But we learned so much in 7, and we kind of want to blame Rita Skeeter for part of it because we know she is a liar. And then you coming to terms with that, but it also not feeling like we're being cheated into new depth for a dead character. And also to give him, again, one of his biggest books and most presence in that, like, I actually think that was really well done. I think his plan involving Snape, and then I think his going back, I think when it comes to J.K. Rowling and some of the answers that we feel like she didn't write perfectly, I actually think those things are really successful.
Yeah, and
It works so
explains.
well because we've all messed up at something, right? And then we've wanted to like not repeat that in the past, or you know, again. And so I think it kind of almost, for me, it really kind of made sense in the end that like, hey, he did all these things, and these things are part of what motivated him to then do better, right? And to like help put good back into the world. But, sorry, Jamie, go ahead.
No, that's fine. I agree, and like, I think it's just part of being a complex person. And my biggest argument for Dumbledore and for the books in general is like, you start with this like children's book and you grow up into this like young adult book, but throughout you learn how complex people can be. And that's the thing with Dumbledore. And this is kind of just something that popped in my head. Okay, we have the Prince's Tale, and in that, Snape finds out, when Snape realizes that he's basically just been protecting Harry to die at the right moment, he says, you have kept him alive so that he can die at the right moment. And Snape's like angry in that moment, like he's defensive almost of Harry.
Does
and
he even say like a pig for slaughter?
I think that's in the movie. I do not think that's in the book. but I
Okay.
could be wrong. And then Dumbledore replies, "Don't be shocked, Severus. How many men and women have you watched die?" And it seems so cold, like in that moment. But then when we get to King's Cross and Dumbledore sees Harry, you see that other side of him where he's like, but I love you so much and I'm so proud of, and in that moment, he's teaching Harry, he's helping Harry glue everything together instead of just telling him. And so it just shows how complicated Dumbledore can be. And I think readers and people in general in life want things to be so black and white. But when we learn about Dumbledore as readers is that like he was just really complicated, and he could be like cold and hard and like very calculated, but at the same time, the love part of him kept like interfering in that in good and hard ways. But anyway, I'll go on to like, so his fictional legacy, what we do know is that, he was basically seen kind of as a war hero in the way that he defeated Grindelwald and he protected everyone from that. And then he also stood against Voldemort. And even though that was very complicated towards the end, people didn't believe him. And then some people did believe him, that he, in the end, stood up against Voldemort, and then that eventually leads to the defeat of Voldemort. He held all those tiles we talked about. He was in the Wizengamot. He was a Supreme Mugwump. He was the inventor of a lot of things within magic. And he was seen as like kind, wise, and nearly infallible, and a beacon of hope, which we see really from his funeral. In private, the people that were actually close to Dumbledore, which wasn't really many people, there was their own views. There was a lot more complex. His brother Aberforth resented him, his ambition and his secrecy. He saw him as cold and using others, including family and especially Harry, to serve his vision. Harry goes, from like worshiping him to feeling betrayed once he learns everything through Rita Skeeter and as they moved on, and then to understanding and forgiving him. Snape respected his intelligence and strategy, but was wary of the manipulation. Their relationship was very complex. I think they loved each other. I think Snape loved Dumbledore, but he was also angry at Dumbledore a lot because of the things he had to do. And, he basically had to sacrifice a lot of himself. He couldn't just become the good guy. He had to play his whole life being the bad guy. And then the Order members became frustrated with Dumbledore towards the end, and they were frustrated after his death because there was so much in secrecy, and Harry knew all this information now and they weren't allowed to know, which is like, why does this child know everything? And then, again, Rita Skeeter's book, that's what a lot of the world was thinking of Dumbledore, and then like learning about him and Grindelwald and Ariana's death. And so it's really unclear again. We don't know what people thought after the final battle with Voldemort. Did Harry, Hermione, and Ron share the full story? Did they try to adjust the memory of Dumbledore in a lot of people's minds? And would that matter? Because, people are going to believe what they want to believe. And I don't know. For me, in the end, I don't think Dumbledore would have cared. I don't think he ever was worried about what people thought of him, which is kind of the beauty of Dumbledore. And so I think his legacy within the book, in the context of this fictional world, was just to serve the greater good and then go away. And so I think that's what happened for him.
Well said, Jamie, on his in-world legacy, because you're right. It is going to vary so much by every person. But it's funny. People talk about this with Game of Thrones, where it's like, well, we're seeing the most important people in that world. And it's like, what does the actual villager, or it's like, if you're a Lannister soldier, does that mean you think like a Lannister? Like, it probably doesn't. You're just a minion. So it's funny to think, yeah, how can we see through the media and through these different characters' eyes the lasting legacy of Dumbledore? Because in the end, like that same thing where you said he's kind of a war hero genius, there is some emanation of he is a great man, and then everyone's going to have the different elements that they take and look at him through that lens in their world. So I want to talk a little bit about his pop culture legacy, which I think is complicated and divisive, because I think someone who hasn't read Harry Potter but has seen the memes, has maybe seen a movie or two, like they have a general awareness of this story. He's a little bit of a cliche wise old wizard. Like I think they would say he's a mentor. And I think that's what's great about what he ends up being, because there's so much more depth to it. And, I should have done this previously, but I'd like to just ask some people who have no real relationship to Harry Potter, like, when you hear Dumbledore, what do you think? Because it's this funny wizard name. He's your classic wizard with a big white beard. But it comes off a lot in fan debates. I think he's divisive in a lot of people who hate the movies. He's one of the big reasons, and not just because of did you put your name in the Goblet of Fire. Like, I think it is a hard character to nail down and keep his role consistent, because I was thinking, I was reading passages of him from the book, and I was like, I've got to reread these books with full context. And we've been banding about ideas for a reread with this, and I think it's a disservice to him to not distinguish him from those fictional things. But the book versus movie fan debate of Dumbledore fascinates me as far as his pop culture legacy goes. And then the other big debate, of course, is Gandalf versus Dumbledore, because Gandalf, the other big white wizard, who is a very different character, has some of the same complexities, but also
Almost
has
played by the same actor.
Yes,
Apparently.
very possibly. Also has this background that they may or may not be filling in Rings of Power that I don't know if I agree with. But anyway, I just want to say, you can't have these two guys fight each other because the magic systems from a nerdy perspective are so different. The way that Gandalf uses magic and Dumbledore uses magic, and what they can do with their wand and their staff, very different. So we shouldn't have them fight. But if they did, yeah, Dumbledore would win. And I know everyone who loves Lord of the Rings or thinks, oh, it's such a better story. Those are two completely different types of fiction as well. The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter are both technically fantasy, but they're not really comparable in that way. One is much more for children and evolves, and the other one is much more like hardcore. Look, reading Lord of the Rings is kind of a pain, okay?
Well, and I will say this too. It's like two very, like you're saying, two very different writing styles. And we're with Gandalf a lot more than we are with Dumbledore. There's just so much more lore and stuff about that world and the magic. So you know the complexities of Gandalf so much more. And magic in that world is like you are a being from the universe.
Yeah.
Like it's so different. Yeah. So who knows? Who knows?
And the way that you utilize it is just different. Okay, Dumbledore would have taken care of the Balrog, no problem. All right, here we go. So we're going to talk about portrayals, because unfortunately I found myself unable to really get rid of the movie guys. I was like, what, when we talk about canon only, 7-book only Dumbledore, and what did they do wrong, and also what does he represent to Harry, it's almost become too muddled because he is such a big character, and I have seen him too much portrayed on screen. Because we had Richard Harris, we had Gambon, which had their differences, but Harris never got to evolve. You know, he only got involved because of his grandkids. He wasn't that into it. I think everyone thinks of him fondly when they look back at him, but he was also playing him very old in a good way. He was old, obviously. He passed away, but there's something warming to his character, and they let him be a little bit more whimsical. But we never got to see him have to attempt the things that Gambon has to attempt. And Gambon had some big missteps, but we don't know what was him versus what was the director, what was in the script, what did they need Dumbledore to be, and they decide that mentor was going to be, and that relationship with Harry was going to be. And in the end, he did convey a lot of the complex emotions. He did take us through the story, but maybe he's something that suffered from the way that the book had to be translated to the movie, whereas, you know, maybe there will be more luxury to spend more time with Dumbledore, although that also gives you more time for inconsistencies, which I think can be concerning. My last note was on Jude Law, who is perfect, but a little too muggle in his dress and vibes. We needed a little bit more silly, whimsical dude, a little too hot. And it is funny. There's like the meme where it shows Jude Law and then it shows Dumbledore in a flashback from like Goblet of Fire, and it's supposed to be like 17 years apart. It's like, ooh, those are rough years. It's like Obi-Wan, because the Obi-Wan show is supposed to only be a few years before he's this old hermit. You know, it's like, sorry, we make too many prequels to keep the timelines consistent. Anyway, lovely for Jude. Maybe we'll get a 12 Uses of Dragon's Blood spinoff for Jude. Otherwise, in fandom, I don't know. It's just like, what does that mean to people? I think there's some memes of Dumbledore. There's some, I think he's had a big impact, but we'll never forget, did you put your name in the Goblet of Fire? There was a joke on Binge Mode, which was kind of a more academic approach. Not, I wouldn't say fully academic, but it was a rewatch of Harry Potter where they went into it and they kept saying no safer place. Like that was their joke about Hogwarts. And I think that is very much a Dumbledore thing. I think part of his legacy is that he's supposed to be this all-knowing protective guy, but all this stuff goes wrong after him. Harry almost dies in all these different ways. And so it does crack me up that he's supposed to be protective, but things just always seem to go wrong. I looked up gifts just because I was like, where do we maybe see him pop up? And he has this one where he's just shrugging in the courtroom. And then the cheers, and he nods and he like tips his goblet from the head table. A lot of people use that gif. And then one of him falling to his death, which is quite funny. And I was just like, where does his face just pop up? But it reminded me, like, what are the lasting images that happen for people who are really disconnected from the fandom, even if they did read the books and watch the movies. And it also made me think, we're talking about very serious stuff, where that's what makes his humor and his wit effective, is that when he would pull out a funny line or be a bit more lighthearted, when he would wink and when silly things would come about, which Gambon did really well sometimes. Some could say it was inconsistent, but I think that's absolutely in the books. And I think that's a part of his character that we are probably not giving much due to, but it's actually a great bit of writing to play on, have this big, massive, important character with all this depth, and then have his quirky moments, which I hope that they're able to maintain. And that should be a special of John Lithgow, who we'll talk about him last, but man is very funny. Okay. Third Rock from the Sun. Beautiful. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about quotes, because I think that his quotes are maybe he's definitely the character with the most impactful quotes from the books. I wrote down a few. Does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live. Happiness can be found in the darkness of times if only one remembers to turn on the light. It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities. It matters not what someone is born, but what they grow to be. And then to the well-organized mind, death is but the next great adventure. And of course, it's happening inside your head, Harry, but why should that mean that's not real? And there are many more. In fact, I think I'm missing a couple of quite epic ones, and I definitely didn't put in all the little quirky ones because they need some context. But he definitely, I think none of these feel Shakespearean. I feel like they feel within his character. It really impactful. But yeah, I wanted to give you guys a minute to, did you guys have any quotes that you felt like you didn't get a squeeze into your other sections that need to be referenced?
Yeah, I have one that I thought was pretty important. It's just from Philosopher's Stone, Sorcerer's Stone. He says, "The truth, it is a beautiful and terrible thing, and should therefore be treated with great caution." So I think early on you're getting this view of like, hey, I have all this information, but I have to treat it with great caution, and all that really pisses people off sometimes.
But
has
that's
a reason.
quite a full circle quote to look at his darker past and then think about what that means. And then in general, if you guys have pop culture impact stuff, I definitely was like, this is kind of hard to contemplate because I have such a specific relationship to the text and to the man.
To the man. I was going to say the happiness can be found even in darkest times is actually a movie quote, but I do think it's one of the best things added to the. No, you're fine, Mitchell.
I did think, no,
a lot of people think that is from the books, but that's because it is such a good quote. It just fits him so much. Did you say this one? It is our choices, Harry, that show who we truly are, far more than our abilities. That's one of my favorite ones. And then I just think, of course, it's happening in your head, Harry. Why on earth should that mean it's not real? Which is one of my favorite quotes of all time. And I think it's just so cool, like from like a writer standpoint of Joe writing this book and like these characters living her head, but it's also meaningful for like Harry and Dumbledore in that moment, especially Harry. But yeah, and just in general, it is so hard because I'm always just so curious about like what movie watchers think of Dumbledore, because it is such a juxtaposition between the two actors. And then also then Jude Law comes in, which is kind of somewhat in the middle. I think he does better of like making Dumbledore seem like a real person, but then our perspective from the books, in the beginning, we just are seeing him through Harry, and he's like this silly, funny guy. But it's going to be interesting to see that portrayed, hopefully in a way where it's like that's the difference between the medium of a book and television, is that like as an audience, are we going to get a peek more into that depth of Dumbledore in the beginning in the first 2 seasons, because there is a lot more to him.
I think one more thing I want to make sure we reference is a few times he's referred to as the only one Voldemort ever feared. And we see that as someone who's powerful, someone who's his teacher, someone who saw through his guise. But we hear that early in the books, and then it comes out when Dumbledore is really upset about Mad-Eye Moody, or Barty Crouch Jr., fooling him and almost killing Harry, as it were. It says Harry like saw in his eyes, oh, that's why he's the only one Voldemort ever feared. And I think that's a really important turning point. I mean, the whole end of that book is a turning point to the darker, more expansive side. And it's going to be an interesting to see how they handle the unraveling and the evolution of his character, going from, he is whimsical and kind of goofy, but he still has a wisdom and like a power about him that, like, when you say, oh, he's a war hero, he's a legend, like, and how that expands from Harry's perspective in this show, because season 1 I do kind of want to feel that, and it's just how it goes from there and how soon that stuff happens. But yeah, I think it is fascinating. I can't divorce the books from the movies in some ways, and I think with his character I do wonder what people who have only seen the movies think, because I can't look at him without the depth I have from the books. But at the same time, those portrayals are so ingrained that I can't also delineate the inconsistencies as well as I should. So he holds a fascinating place in pop culture.
I just say too, like, I think a major moment that was in pop culture too was after the books were done, I believe, and that's when J.K. Rowling revealed that he was gay. And that was a major moment in pop culture at that time. A lot of people were upset about that or felt like betrayed by that. Even, how far we've come with acceptance. That was a big moment in general that, and she kind of, I think I've said this before, kind of said in a way like, oh, isn't it obvious that he's gay? But I do think that did have like a little bump in the moment of his legacy in pop culture, because a lot of people took that different ways, and it like kind of revealed a lot of things about a lot of people. But again, it added so much depth to his relationship with Grindelwald, and it does explain like certain things.
Well, because it then comes off as like, is this tokenism? Did you just say that to be like, oh yeah, there's representation there? And then if you're part of the LGBTQ community, you're like, well, then we didn't get to see
Yes,
it. It didn't affect the story.
Yes.
When really that is a bit of a retcon in that it affects the story massively. But now that we know that and it's been done, are they going to show that in some way in the show? I thought the Fantastic Beasts one handled it really well. It wasn't really explicit. It was referred to in the second and then explicitly talked about in the third that they had this relationship. But I think within Harry's story, his sexuality doesn't impact it, but does it impact his personality in any other way, for better or for worse? Is that going to come off as a positive or negative for anyone who was happy about it, upset about it? And you could have been upset about it from different directions, but it was a pop culture moment that needs to be brought in, because then J.K. Rowling's tweets have become part of the Harry Potter pop culture legacy, where once in a while they were fun, quirky thoughts, and eventually we get Pottermore kind of after that. But she was just kind of throwing out like, yeah, this is what this is. And of course, Anthony Goldstein was always Jewish. She kind of threw that one out there, and that didn't help that much, because people are like, well, then you name this character Cho Chang, and you named it anyway.
It did seem a little bit like trying to make up for things in general, but I just want to put that out there because that was a big moment, I think, in pop culture about Dumbledore. And personally, for me, it did not change much of my perspective of him. It just added a little bit more to the character. But then later for Fantastic Beasts, obviously, that means something more and different.
It changed the impetus of a lot of who he turned out to be. But say we never got Fantastic Beasts and we only got that Grindelwald bit, I think if you are a person who wanted that representation, then you're like, well, why was it absent? And if you're a person who didn't want the representation, like, why'd she have to say that? So it was actually like, it just felt random, but it honestly didn't change. I was like, I don't think that impacted the story then. So maybe it didn't need to be said, other than in Deathly Hallows, it is now odd that it wasn't said that was romantic. And she felt like it was a little bit more implied. And I was like, I didn't get that implication, but I wasn't looking for it. And so,
and like, would you be looking for it when it's not a book about him? It's about Harry, and it's from a young person's perspective.
That's what's interesting about it. It's just that, like, there are so many characters out there where, like, it's declared early on, like, hey, this character's gay, or this character's, this, and it's like such a huge part of who they are, and like they have to do certain things, and sometimes that I've seen cases where that really actually hurts the story. It's just like, no, like, let them do their thing. And like, does who they love, like, does it matter? Like you said, arguably in Deathly Hallows, I think that comes into play. But otherwise, it's kind of like, hey, he's a good headmaster, right? And he still, cares about the kids, and he cares about Harry, and he's fighting this war against evil. And it's kind of like, how much does that actually change it? Like, does it need to be put out there, from the get-go? Or will that then define, everything too much?
That's kind of where it comes back to. She could say then, oh, it didn't really affect things. And I think that's fine. And I'm very happy with the books the way they were. But like, there are times when, it's mentioned for a character, but it doesn't impact them for negative or positive. It's part of their existence, but their romantic life isn't involved. I think this kind of comes up when you talk about telling stories or writing involving other races. It's like, well, race is always going to play in someone's life experience. So do they need to interact with a situation differently because they've experienced prejudice? And it's just like, you have to measure where it needs to be involved and not involved. And I don't think the story is negative for it, but I do think she maybe she set herself up for something in the future. but I think at that point it did feel random, and not necessarily for better or for worse, but I think it didn't. I don't know if she expected to come off brilliantly, like, oh, that's great, but
What a reveal that would have been in the books, though, even in 7. But I was going to say, but I was like, from Harry's perspective, when you're like an elementary school kid or a middle school kid, you think your teachers like basically live at the school. You have no thought about their life outside of school, like if your teacher's married or have kids, you don't care. And I was gonna say, like, on the Wizarding World website, I do not know if there was more when there was Pottermore, but there's like one paragraph about Dumbledore, which is very annoying to me. Like, I think I copy and pasted it into our notes. I'm like, give us some more. Like we had that whole deep dive on like McGonagall and got like that kind of story about her past. And I wonder if there was anything like that for Dumbledore before, because there isn't anything like that for Dumbledore now.
Well, it's interesting because McGonagall,
they were holding it all for the Secrets of Dumbledore.
Yeah.
That's true.
Until, that whole series bombed.
We do learn about McGonagall's romantic past a little bit. Obviously, Snape's romantic past is critical to the show, but it's just interesting because everyone has romantic experiences and past to some degree. So it's interesting, but also you're right. Like, I think there's a point in new stories to have representation, and so sometimes I think actually bisexual people get this a lot, where there seems to be a point in the story where they feel the need to point out, oh, they date boys and girls all the time, but it just, you never know how it's going to represent in the story. So yeah, it felt like it was neither done justice and it could have been left out, but then it would have been left out, and it was kind of a no man's land situation. But I think it is important as pop culture experience, and we'll see if it is employed in this television show in any way. But I think that's kind of where we come to our golden snitch moment here, is what does this all mean for the TV show? What is most important for the tone and temperament of this character? What do we want to see from John Lithgow, an actor we love, an actor who I think can do serious, can do funny, and is proven he can do British. But yeah, so Steven's going to take us through what this really means for the show that we are hoping to see the best portrayal and the most book accurate and good evolution of this deep character.
I thought you were going to say the show we're hoping to see in January of 2027, because if they push it any further than that, I'm kidding. But no, I think one of the biggest pieces of this that's going to be really interesting is that, like you said, we had 3 different actors play Dumbledore so far, and each of them has kind of done it at different points in the story that are relatively different, right? So like you said, we have the whimsical, like more fun, more magical Dumbledore in the beginning. And then as you get to, those later books, things start to get darker. He's more serious. He's a bit more of like a general in some cases, right? Or leading a spy ring of sorts. But then you get Jude Law, right? Where you jump back in time and he's kind of doing a little bit more of the spy ring type of stuff. But it's a very different view on the character, and it's decades before, so I think it works. But we're going to get to see this time is going to be the evolution, right, over these 10 years, these 7 seasons of the character. Harry meeting him and Harry's view being one thing, and it'll be interesting to see if we see aside moments that are not from Harry's perspective, where maybe we see Dumbledore more in his, command and control type of persona, depending on the audience or something. I think of moments like when they have the troll in the dungeons, right? And the students are all kind of, like they're all hiding and concerned, and Dumbledore, it's a moment where we don't really see it very clearly in the books or the movies, but he takes charge, right? And he's like, if the students over here where it's safe, we're going to search the castle. It's not like, I kind of imagine that as a kid as like a school principal out of sorts, like, hey, let's we're going to have to go search and find it. But no, he's dealt with some pretty tough crap before. We know that. And so it'd be an interesting way for them to insert those moments of like, here's fun Dumbledore and here's Dumbledore, taking care of business. And so some of that, being gentle without being too soft, being dangerous without raising his voice, being serious and voicing concern without, being panicked and shaking Harry like a rag doll, asking him if he put his name in the goblet of fire.
Don't shake a student.
Yeah. Good rule to note, Lithgow. So if it follows the books right across those, we'll get to see him shift from that quirky, twinkling headmaster to the emotionally withholding commander type to the morally haunted person that we see in Deathly Hallows, right? Where we see the context of why he is kind of the way he is. I will say that all of this hinges on Lithgow living to a ripe old age of what is it that he has to get to? 88? Is that it?
I think it's 89.
And I have my doubts. So go take your freaking vitamins, man. Make sure you are seeing the doctor frequently. or we're going to have another switch.
He's depending
here.
on the NHS, man.
But anyway, Lithgow, we know he can command a room, right? He's taken some really interesting roles and a very wide variety, right? I think you guys can speak to a lot of them that you've seen too. But Mitchell mentioned Third Rock from the Sun. I think of playing the villain in Shrek, in the first Shrek movie, Winston Churchill in The Crown, right? So he has this like ability to have like this intellectual gravity, some of the gravitas that comes with playing someone like Churchill.
He's done a lot of Shakespeare.
Also do funny. He has done a lot of Shakespeare. This is true. So we don't understand him until all the way through. And really, like we mentioned in book 7, he shows up more in that book. We learn more about him than any other book, it seems like. And it's all through flashbacks and other people telling stories. And so we're really interesting to see how they play that in the end. I mean, assuming he's still alive. If he's not, maybe they'll have to get really creative with how they talk about him and share that stuff. But he'll use the Shakespeare chops, and there's a quote here. He said, he can deliver lines like, "You must be the one to kill him, Harry," and make you feel a little bit like you're watching King Lear or some other very serious play involving lots of murder, because he's got to be the one to kind of direct those types of actions as well. So I think Lithgow can do it. I think it'll be really interesting, but I think that there's definitely a tall task ahead of him, and I mean the whole team creating the series.
Well, I think the whole team is actually a good reference, because that's something I thought of, is like, he's done great things. I think he was in Conclave, which was a big movie from last year about choosing the next pope. And he was playing kind of a snivelly guy who, like, he is a lead and he is powerful, but at the same time, he's got like, he plays this duality really wonderfully, actually. And I just think he can do anything. And he's coming into the role with a little bit of naivety if you've read his interviews, but I think he can do it. The question to me is then, okay, he's playing along now with writers and directors. So now we have to look at the script, and now we have to look at what he's being asked to do on set. If they're asking him to take a more quirky or a more funny or a more shaking and screaming thing, I think they'll avoid some of that, because there's been so much blowback against it. But yeah, I would say we don't know what he's going to look like. I do think that, like, that the world that they put him in and what they ask of him, I think is also going to be a factor. But I think I do wonder, say we watch season 1, if we can isolate and say, ooh, the writers and directors did a good job on this season, but they did this one character dirty. Obviously, Harry and Dumbledore cannot be that character. It would suck if it was Ron or Hermione. Hopefully it's no one. But I was going to say, like, oh, that would be trouble. If it was a Snape or like Neville, I'm like, yeah, there's no one that you want to, but it is just interesting to think there might be a misstep. There's not going to be a perfect series, but I just do think that there's a few other people who are going to affect this portrayal besides the actor himself, because someone's going to be writing those lines and asking, even if they give him a lot of freedom with the character, they're going to be asking of him what they need in each individual moment as he's coming in fresh to this story. But he's done so great with almost every material he's been given in. I haven't seen anything where maybe I need to go back and watch some of his filmography. I did not have time for that this week, but just really raising my 2-week-old child. But I do wonder, is there something I've not liked him in? Not that I can think of, but it does partially depend on some other people. But that's going to be reflective of all the characters.
Well, and I think hopefully what the actors are given this time, which we did not have in the original movies, is they have the gift of knowing the whole story and where their characters go. Gary Oldman just recently said he loved playing Sirius, and he talks a lot about that role, and like the time it came up in his life was really good for him because he needed the money financially and stuff. But he said he really thinks he could have done better, and he really wishes he had known the whole arc of Sirius. He said he talks about how the only person that knew their arc at that point in time was Alan Rickman about Snape, like
who was great.
That's the only person that Joe told what happens to them, and he said he really wishes that he would have known, because he would have played the character very differently, which I hope all these actors are doing that and they're studying. I get the perspective of maybe like, oh, I'm just going to do a book at a time or this, but it's like, no, you need to like know as much as you can. And Lithgow did say that he was reading the books, and so hopefully he's finished now before starting to film.
Well, he needs to know his past, because again, in the last book, we get so much of him from stuff that happens years and years ago that would affect a performance in your first book. Because even if you're that whimsical guy, it's like, hey, what other little bits are you putting in there to add to it?
And no one's going to be perfect, obviously, because everyone's human and these are just actors and they're doing their best. But it's like, man, that balance of like, okay, do we want to see you know, with a kid sitting down and watching the show, do they want to see the Dumbledore that we hear about in the first book? You know, like who we see, and he's like just this gentle, you know, pip pip kind of like sweet old man, but we want to see the underlying, there's so much more to it. And so is he going to play all that but not lose that magic for young kids? Because you want them to have those reveals later, and you want them to grow up and like see Dumbledore in a different light. It's interesting to see what happens, and I'm sure he's taking his vitamins.
But yeah, great character and critical. And even if he's not perfect, I think we've talked about the things that emanate from this character that need to get right in relation to Harry on this plot that are going to matter the most. Because say they pull back on him to some degree and he is a little bit more mythical, and then as he unravels, like he plays his part, it just needs to be consistent, and it needs to feel like that Dumbledore that we know from the book. But there are different things that they could do to it, and we just, you know, want it to be as wonderful as possible. Did you guys have any final words on Mr. Albus, Percival, Wulfric, Brian?
I liked doing this, like breaking it down by character. I'm excited to do more characters. I don't know if people are going to listen to all this, but it was a different way to look at things.
It's true. It was cool. Well, and one thing that I enjoyed, you guys probably saw in our notes that I changed this earlier today, but I moved kind of our timeline into like a table format, because I was trying to piece together what was happening in the world during these times, right? As we see like different years. So we know that like World War II ended around the same time as the battle with Grindelwald, which I've always found really interesting. But I just thought I'd share a couple of other interesting ones. So like when Albus was born in 1881, it was still in the middle of the Victorian era. So Queen Victoria was, I don't know, middle of her reign. Cowboys were huge in the West. The Wild West was really cranky, which a lot of people don't realize happened at the same time. President James Garfield was shot. I mean, he didn't die till a couple months later, but arguably was assassinated. The Red Cross was founded that year, and the first international phone call was made. So some cool things happened in that year. And then the other one I thought was interesting was just around the time he started at Hogwarts in the 1920s. So remember, that was like the height of jazz and the flappers and prohibition movement, and F. Scott Fitzgerald releasing several books based around that time frame. Charles Lindbergh made the first solo flight across the Atlantic during that, right? So he's teaching at school, and there's these other things happening around the other parts of the world. And then the last one I'll share is in 1938, when Dumbledore meets Tom Riddle for the first time at the orphanage. That's the same year that the atom was split for the first time. So that's kind of an interesting connection. And also when Germany annexed Austria. So that is when like World War II really started to pick up speed, when Germany started taking over the other European countries. So
what I do wonder how she intended to weave Grindelwald stuff into World War II, because it can't have nothing to do with each other. But
I mean, the X-Men were able to do it pretty well. They did. So I would be really curious.
I sent you guys the other day, of course, people do like the explain a plot badly or something. And there's a TikTok of someone being like, a teacher kills a Holocaust survivor and his friends or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a group of teachers take some of their students to go torture or try to kill a Holocaust survivor.
Yeah. And he was talking about X-Men, which I got way before the host of that podcast. I'd like to brag. Anyway, it is interesting. But I think you're right. And it's also interesting is there's been some explanations on Pottermore, which I think you could have left alone, about why wizards adopted like radio and steam engines, but not other forms of technology, or how magic doesn't agree with some forms of technology. And it's always kind of cracked me up how they try and shadow that line. And to think that Dumbledore literally saw, you know, he dies in the 90s, you know, so he's full on internet, but every other technological advancement he does see, including like flight and everything, and how they ignore and balance and live in their own world. I do wonder if at some point Grindelwald was like, you know what, Muggles might stand a chance this time. Anyway, that's been our deep dive into Albus Dumbledore, a classic character. And we have not selected the next character yet. So it may be a surprise, but also if you have a character you think deserves this treatment, I think there's some minor characters to be fun, because if we hit this level of depth, it could be more fun in some ways. There's more for us to extrapolate, but there's also Harry, Ron, Hermione, Voldemort, I think, Hagrid, characters where maybe there is that much material that we can dive into. So if you have a suggestion, please leave a comment below wherever you're listening to this podcast, and please let us know your thoughts, what we got wrong about Dumbledore, what you want to see from Dumbledore in the coming television show. If you do want to interact with us in any way, feel free to follow us on socials at HPTV or email us at hptvpodcast@gmail.com. But we will continue updating those socials, and we do live reactions to different pieces of news that emerge, pieces of imagery, and then of course we always come back together on the podcast to really dive into those things. And we're going to keep diving into characters and coming up with other ideas, fun ways that we can go into the Harry Potter world, and look forward to the Harry Potter TV series coming up on HBO in 2027. Jamie, you can send us out.
Peace out, snitches.